everyone. Welcome to today's episode of Carbon Experts Live. This is a show produced by One Click LCA to promote sustainable construction and manufacturing, featuring industry experts. I'm very excited to be joined by Farah Naz, Director of ESG and Innovation for AECOM Middle East. Today, we are going to discuss about how to establish a systematic approach towards decarbonization. And today's episode would be especially important for urban planners, developers, and sustainability professionals. My name is Muhammad Ali, and I look after in the international sustainability communications at OneClick LCA. I'm your host for today's episode of Carbon Experts Live, and I'm joined by my colleague Natasha, who is an LCA and EPD expert at OneClick LCA, and she would be leading today's discussion with me and Farah. Before moving on, I would like to briefly introduce our today's guest, Farah, to you. Farah Naz is the Director of ESG and Innovation for AECOM Middle East. She is a chartered engineer, a fellow of CIBSE, an award-winning climbing strategist, Zaid Inspirer, and also has been honored with the Most Influential Woman of the Year recognition in 2024. She has authored the Middle East region's first book on decarbonization, titled as Net Zero City 10-Year Transformational Plan for Our Cities in 2021. And she has also published a children's book on climate change named as Mission Zero. Farah has over 20 years of experience in the built environment, working across 4 continents and in the UAE, and has led the sustainability projects for like the Museum of the Future in Dubai, BIA headquarter in Sharjah, the Expo 2020 Sustainability Pavilion, and very recently she led the sustainability strategy and carbon management work for COP28 in UAE. Farah, it's great to have you here today.
Thank you so much for having me, Mohammed.
You are welcome. So before moving forward, we would like to share some of the housekeeping rules on what can expect from this session. We will start by having a conversation with Farah about how exploring the post-COP28 world and understanding how you can establish a systematic approach towards carbon-conscious investment. We'll then invite Farah to answer questions around today's topic. And lastly, we'll close with a live Q&A session where Farah and Natasha will answer your questions. So you can already go ahead and start asking questions in the chat for on live LinkedIn. If you're seeing on live stream, you can put them in the comment section and we'll answer them at the end of this session. Now, before we start, I would like to invite Farah and Natasha to briefly talk about AECOM and OneClick LCA. Farah, I will turn this over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here with me today. So, I'm the Director of ESG and Innovation, as Mohammed mentioned. AECOM is the world's largest infrastructure company. We work globally and especially in this part of the world, and we have a responsibility towards climate change and resiliency of the built environment. So, really excited to be here today to talk about our work regionally in the MENA region, as well as globally, and how we are making transformation a reality for the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Farah. Natasha, can you briefly introduce monthly LCA for our audience?
Sure. Thank you, Farah, for joining us in this discussion. Good morning, everyone. I'm Natasha. I'm the Business Development Manager for OneClick LCA. I handle the Asian and the Middle East markets. OneClick LCA, we are the world's leading LCA software for construction and manufacturing sector. We have a tool for every green building standard, and you can also use the software for EPD calculations, even for infrastructure calculations, which is one of the topics that is very hot right now in the Middle East. We have more than 250,000 data sets. We have integrations with 20 plus design tools such as Revit, IES, Design Builder. So you can use the tool from every stage of the design. From your concept stage, you can use Carbon Designer. You can use different types of integrations to optimize your design. You can compare between two data points. You can compare between two designs. And you can also model building circularity understand cost versus carbon benefits, which is one of the topics that we are going to be discussing with Farah today. And all of our reports are also compliant with various green building ESG frameworks, such as CDP, GRESB. Uh, so yeah, so that's about one click LCA. Thank you. All right. I think we can go ahead with the questions. Yeah. All right. So the first question that we have is, what are the key commitments made during COP28? Some of them is like tripling renewable energy, buildings breakthrough, and the cooling pledge. So can you explain a bit more about this, Farah?
So thank you so much for the question. So we are 6 months past COP28, and the commitments made by the global leaders, especially the UAE government, is quite important. So from the built environment perspective, there's four commitments that are quite important. First is the Global Renewable and Energy Efficiency Pledge. Essentially, this pledge talks about tripling renewable investment. It talks about the capacity building by 2030, and essentially doubling the energy efficiency. So globally, most buildings in the built environment are 2% efficient from different levels that was calculated by IPCC, and now the idea is to move it to 4%. So I'm talking about globally, not just the region.
Mm,
So the Global Renewable and Energy Efficiency Pledge was very important because it's the first steps towards decarbonization and climate finance. The second thing is the global cooling pledge. So there is data showing that our world is heating up, and from now till 2050, 14 billion, I repeat again, 14 billion air conditioning units will be sold globally.
mhm,
And we don't often realize, but cooling equipments account for 7% of global greenhouse gas emission. So there's a pledge initiated by the UAE government, and during COP28, 10 countries have signed up, and now it reached to more than 70 countries. And the main reason for the pledge is to drive efficiency design in HVAC system. So that means all the cooling systems had to be more than 50% efficient globally in this part of the world. This is a very positive drive and for a positive pledge. The third one I would like to talk to is about Buildings Breakthrough Report. So I was in the blue zone when this was launched. It's called Buildings Breakthrough Report 2023, and essentially this report talks about the built environment and what are the roles and responsibilities for all of us to drive decarbonization and net zero transition. And what is really good is that this was driven by Global ABC, which is a global organization. The report was launched during COP28 in the Blue Zone. And the idea was to bring in the built environment and give them KPIs and targets. So globally, each country and region has a tangible target to work towards. Sometimes cement and other materials were brought in. Steel was brought in into the conversation because globally there's a lot of cement and steel production currently taking place to build our cities and communities. The fourth one was methane pledge, which was more related to the agriculture and the food system. It not directly but indirectly affects our environment. So there was a huge methane pledge signed by different parties that looks at positive food systems and how we can reduce the methane, which is a big greenhouse gas emission. I think COP finished, completed during mid December. But what happened in the UAE after COP was quite phenomenal. On January 8th, 2024, UAE launched its first long term net zero strategy. And that's a really positive move because it provides a tangible KPIs and targets and a policy driven approach to drive decarbonization and net zero transition for UAE. And this is extremely positive. There are other parts of the world who has also published different different reports and policies and guidances. So the idea is to summarize that pledges were identified, pledges were pledged, different countries signed up, but then the action and implementation is quite important. And that's why I mentioned the net zero long-term strategy that UAE government has published, because that will start the journey of net zero transition from a policy perspective in this part of the world.
Okay. Thank you so much for such a detailed answer. I just have a few questions. One is UAE has taken such a bold step in pledging for a net zero carbon strategy to be implemented. How do we demystify carbon for the industry and the general stakeholders in terms of investors, architects? How do we do that? Because generally there is like a clouded understanding of what carbon is.
That is a very important question, and thank you for asking that. So, carbon is not one of the matrix that's usually industry looks at. But I will give you an example. 10 years ago, when LEED was launched, or Estadama was launched 12 years ago in this part of the world, people really didn't know how to go about with it. And now all the projects are going for Estadama in this part of the world and LEED globally. So the way to understand carbon is everything that we do involves carbon, even a cup of coffee. And we all live within the carbon cycle. That means us as humans and animals, we breathe in and out. So we release carbon and take oxygen in our bodies, where there's a planetary system, and all the plants does the opposite. So carbon is a matrix that's used. It's part of a green, it's one of the greenhouse gases. And the reason why carbon is used as a matrix, because it's the simplest way to quantify or to understand how the impact of built environment is affecting the carbon cycle or our planetary boundaries. So this is the simplest way to kind of describe carbon. But you are right, it's not something that we often think about. But I think the more we talk about, the more awareness and education is out there, more tools are used to assess carbon in our materials, it will gradually demystify for the built environment and for the general public.
All right. Thank you so much for that answer. I think we can go to the next question. That is, what is the next big carbon conversation in the commitment to accelerations of renewable deployment?
So we are at 2024, and in COP28, a lot of pledges looks at 2050 as the ultimate target, but there's lots of tangible and KPIs targets have been set for 2030 and 2040. So the two big conversation in terms of carbon, one would be near zero emissions. You will say I didn't say net zero, near zero carbon emissions and climate resilient buildings. Globally, what we have seen for the last 6 months, from China to India to Pakistan to different parts of Europe and here in UAE, we had a lot of storm events. And some of these storm events were not just a 100-year storm, it was 200-year storm or 100 more than that, and it had a lot of impact. So the big thing that we would start seeing is not just looking at energy and carbon for our buildings, but also looking at climate resiliency. Now, in order to simplify that, what does a near zero emission or climate resilient building look like? Well, the building will look like generally how it looks, but it will have a life cycle assessment done of the carbon intent of the materials. Buildings use a lot of material. Our design and construction process uses a lot of energy, a lot of materials. So really understanding what materials we are choosing, what's the carbon impact of these materials, uh, is something that we would be seeing a lot happening. There's a lot of tools, especially One Click LC is a tool that is used globally to look at carbon, the embodied carbon of design stages, but also tools that are used to look at the operational energy and carbon. So, well, what we would really like to see is a carbon consciousness in terms of investors, developers, general public. So, to really understand carbon is not just a scientist who deals with, but it's something that we work across day to day to address climate science to address net zero emissions and make it more realistic. So we would really urge the architects and urban planners when they're designing to design with a carbon consciousness in mind and really understand what is the carbon impact of my urban planning, or what is the carbon impact of the materials I'm choosing for my project. The second thing I would say is the cost of decarbonization. Um, Globally, it's estimated by UN that 3.5 trillion US dollars is required from 2021 to 2050. And that's why the climate finance have been discussed, and it was a big part of the COP28 conversation. Every year our emissions in the built environment is rising by 1%. So we really need to understand what is the cost of decarbonization from a developer's perspective, from an investor's perspective, and from an operational perspective. It's really important to understand the materials we are choosing as a design stage. What is the impact of carbon and cost? So we at AECOM, for all our projects, we strive to do cost and carbon modeling. And what it means is like we just don't give advice on what are the right choices of materials in terms of thermal comfort and climate, but what is the carbon and cost impact of these materials. Now, why is that important? It allows the client, it allows general public, it allows investors and developers to make decisions on the capex and opex of their choices. So when we show the design cost of carbon and the operational cost of carbon of a material, for example, concrete or wood or steel or glass, which are the materials they're normally used, then they have the opportunity and the flexibility and the agility and evidence-based approach to understand what is the capex if we use a material that's less carbon intensive, but more better for the environment, but a little bit higher cost. What is the operational impact of that? So these kind of analysis thinking can only come if we can show evidence-based approach to cost and carbon modeling.
I think it's very interesting that you touched upon the cost aspect, Farah, because this morning I just saw the news, and UAE is going to invest $2 billion on climate risk, not even climate risk, flood risk. So it's very interesting to see that a country that is historically uh, a desert, you are now investing $2 billion for flood risk mitigation. It really shows that if we do not catch up, there's going to be not just adverse effects for humanity, there's also going to be a lot of effect on the cost aspect, and even for businesses to thrive in such environments, because it's going to be difficult for people to understand how they're supposed to allocate their funds.
Exactly, because the how we do our business case analysis and how we look at our investments globally is on a shift. That's why the Asset Owners Alliance was founded, and now it's attributed with UN champions, because globally now the investors and the building owners are coming together, because this is a new field for all of us globally and this part of the world. This is a new field, and really understanding what is the impact of the decisions from a cost perspective and carbon perspective is really, really important, because that provides general public, investors, developers the idea that what kind of choices they can make and what are the options they should choose from.
Yes, and the Middle East, it's historically, a fossil fuel based economy, whether it is KSA or whether it is UAE. But from the turn of century onwards, they are investing in renewables, because I think it's a huge shift for economies, like large scale economies like the Middle East, to shift from a profitable fossil based economy to a renewable uh, deployment, or like having megawatt projects. Like I just saw that UAE has a 1 megawatt project that is happening in one of the deserts. I think it's really interesting to see how things are shifting, and it definitely shows that how the influence of COP and other influential leaders are really changing the directive and the direction in which countries are moving and policies are being developed. All right. So I will ask my next question. That is, how to initiate systemic change in carbon, collaboration, and capex towards future proofing infrastructure investment.
So, in order to answer that question, I'm just going to say a little bit of the history of net zero. Okay, so we are in the third phase of net zero's target setting and implementation. And what do I need? What do I mean by that? A decade ago, net zero was just a scientific concept. Everybody in the science, in the field of climate science, and scientists knew about this something called net zero. You couldn't Google it, you couldn't find it in any of the Google or Yahoo websites. Then in 2018, IPCC issued a report. It's called Seminal Report. And in that report, they talked about why the world needs to move into a net zero transition. And they mentioned first time the 2050 transition of net zero. Now, that was 2018. And then in 2022, during COP27, Antonio Guterres, supported by UN, published a very interesting report called Integrity Matters. And the reason why this report was called Integrity Matters is because this was the first time a net zero target, a KPI goal, was set. Now, why am I discussing about this? Because from 2021 to 2022 and 2023, there's a net zero global stocktake report has been published. And what this report talks about, it talks about the global net zero transition, the companies, the cities who are signing up for it, what they're doing, and where we need to push. This really helps the general public, the investors, the developers to understand where the push, where the research and development needs to come in, and where do we need to focus on funding. So, coming back to your question, carbon is becoming an essential part of the conversation. Very similar to 12 years ago when people talked about sustainability, everybody thought it was expensive and it's going to add 20% on the capex. But right now, sustainability lead SDM is something we do generally. We absorb the cost. We have seen and proven in last 12 years that how positively using SDAMA and lead can provide design and operational savings. So, carbon right now is a big part of the conversation, and essentially it's becoming a decision making tool. Because when we talk to clients about cost and carbon modeling of the choices of materials they're choosing in terms of glass, concrete, other materials, that shifts the conversation. That shifts the business analysis and business modeling of the decision making of our portfolio level. The second thing is that it's really important to understand our planetary boundaries. So, Johann Rockström in 2009, with a group of 28 scientists, established something called planetary boundaries. Anybody can Google it. Essentially, it talks about 9 parameters where to thrive as human beings, we need to look at all these parameters. Now, carbon and climate change is part of that parameters, part of these planetary boundaries, because as I mentioned, we all breathe, we all live within the carbon cycle, and some level of greenhouse gas emission is good for the environment. But the fact that it has gone beyond the balance, that's the imbalance that's been caused. So when we talk about clean energy transition, when we are talking about food systems and production, essentially we're talking about how do we rebalance our greenhouse gas emission. So, the reason I mentioned the planetary boundaries is that one of the two key ideas or two key concepts that we really need to focus on first is the clean energy transition. And what that means is that how do we convert our current fossil fuel economy towards a clean energy focus, research and development on that. That's why the net zero concept comes very effectively, because that's why all the cities and companies have signed up to identify how do they start this journey together. The second thing is the food system. It's very important for all of us to find out ways to develop our food that doesn't pollute the environment and preserves the water. So I talked about two things, energy transition and food systems. Essentially, when we look at our cities and communities, the interrelationship of food, energy, and water nexus is very important. We can't just look at energy transition or energy reduction and emission and say a city or a building or a community is net zero. In order to make a decarbonization journey or near net zero journey or a complete net zero journey, we need to look at the interdependency of food production, the water, where water is coming from, how we are using water, and how much we're using for our agriculture and the energy transition. These three things, once it comes together for a city, for a community, that creates a proper balance. Now, the last part I want to respond to is how do you quantify what good looks like? There's For the last 6, 7 years, there was no real tangible assessment for net zero buildings or net zero communities or net zero infrastructures, because infrastructure has a lot of carbon emission because of the materials used. So last year, April, past 2080, global carbon assessment has been established. This is a global assessment and it looks at infrastructure, buildings, and master plan level carbon emission. Now, regulations, it's not a regulation, assessments like past 2080 or ISO net zero certification, these are very important because this gives the investors and the developers what good looks like. We need to have a target, we need to have a goal to identify how it comes together, why it's important, how do we achieve that. So these kind of assessments plays an important role in terms of bringing our planetary boundaries, bringing our design into a coherent way where we are designing with the end goal in mind. And lastly, I would say that education and awareness plays a big role. We have to educate ourselves, we have to educate our teams, our employees. We have to start having this conversation with our clients, with our coworkers, just to make demystify the whole carbon. It goes back to your first question that you asked me, how do we demystify? The more we talk about it and the more we make it part of our conversation, the better solutions we would be achieving.
I think in energy modeling, there is a concept that what gets measured gets managed. It's a similar concept that what anything that you measure or you have certain benchmarks and roles, only that gets sort of managed, and there you can develop a reduction strategy for that. I also like the concept of what good looks like. It's a question that we should ask ourselves. As built environment professionals, because as built environment professionals, energy, the grid's getting decarbonized, but there's sort of like a myopic view when it comes to embodied carbon. So we have to, like how you said, collate both and figure out how.
Very important point.
Yeah.
I just want to touch on one thing. What good looks like for a city like Copenhagen going for net zero carbon or net zero energy is very different for a city like Dubai, because we have different climatic conditions. The food system, the infrastructure, the water, everything is different. So it's very important for all of us to understand the contextual, habitual characteristics of where we are building, of the city and the people and interconnectivity. And that's why concepts like food, energy, water nexus, the how the climate would look today, but we also need to look at the future foresight because our climates are changing. This summer, Milan was much hotter than Dubai. There are days where I was checking the temperature and it was unrealistic. So we are seeing more of this. It's not just this year, it's last few years this is happening. Certain parts of Europe is heating up really rapidly, and over here in UAE and Saudi Arabia, yes, they're heating up, but there are also sometimes different climatic situations we're seeing. So this is why this idea of what good looks like is very important, because as we look at decarbonization of our buildings, as we look at the energy transition, we also need to be very cognizant of the climate resiliency of our projects, of our buildings, of our cities, and our future. And we need to really merge this together, because right now we can't just look at decarbonization. It has to be decarbonization as well as climate resilient buildings and communities and
Yes.
cities.
Uh, so, Farah, can you tell me, like, in terms of stakeholders, all right, what can be the short term, the mid term, and the long term goal that they can do to sort of address this issue?
So, first of all, we really need a urban, like a systems thinking framework. Okay, and this is what it's a thinking framework where bring all the stakeholders in to understand, visualize what good looks like, what is the project's goal. So when a project, for example, I'll give you an example, comes with a goal of Estadama or LEED, I think it's important to ask, okay, if this is the current goal, how do we push it forward and look at the UAE's long-term net zero strategy, and how do we create that pathway from highest Estadama rating to highest LEED rating to a net zero or a near net zero. So we really need to create that pathway and plan, and we need to be very open and bring the stakeholders together to have those, create those eco plans, if I may say so. Now, as an urban systems framework, this is something I mentioned in my book, Net Zero Cities. This is a framework that was developed by um, Oxford University. And this framework has been used for 100 cities in the world. And it talks about governance, number one. Number two, urban design. Number three, urban economics, which is mostly about circular economy and innovation. Four, it's about urban infrastructure. That means it talks about innovation, energy, food, energy, and water infrastructure. And then what kind of digitization process is required. And lastly, the overall, the fifth one is livability and health and well-being. Because at the end of the day, what we are doing is we are doing for cities. We're doing for the people and the betterment of the people. So urban cities use in many of my projects that has gone for a net zero or near net zero or net zero assessments, because it's a way to look at multiple division of entities and bring together in a framework, and then identify, okay, where do we really want to push the boundaries. For example, some projects, it's really easy to push the boundaries for waste or energy, but water might become difficult, and really look at the circularity of systems in this urban systems framework. So that's one of the frameworks we use. And then what it does is, the second layer is the business modeling, really understanding where we can create the ecosystem for entrepreneurs to come in, where we can bring in different technologies to grow food and have a circular system. For example, aquaponics, it's becoming really big because we really need to find ways to grow our food where we don't pollute our environment, we don't use much water. So if in a community food is produced, children learn how to produce food themselves. We create that ecosystem of entrepreneurs coming in and growing the business of growing food production with restaurants and industries. And we also create a livable community, even though it's an urban community, but it's connected to city, it's connected to the greenery. So, and that has this is a different type of business plan and approach and analysis, because people will be attracted to that community not just for energy efficient buildings, but it's a community it's created growing its own food, whatever percentage it is, and creating that vibe that we are striving to do something more. I think in this condition globally, what we're facing, it's very important to look at not how much less bad we are doing, but it's very important to look at how can we do more good. And that's where the conversation shifts. So it's really important when we're working with stakeholders using urban system framework and talking to them about how do we shift higher from the highest Esidama or highest lead targets. It's important to have those tangible and intangible conversation and absorb those KPIs and goals and targets of what does business as usual look like? What does a stretch target look like for this community? And for example, what does a pioneering or near net zero or net zero target would look like? And creating this roadmap with the developers, with the investors, with the building owners really gives them a level of flexibility, a level of understanding of their investments. Where should they invest first? How should they invest? And why should they invest? So there's a lot of it's a multi-dimensional ways of approaching a eco-conscious decarbonization plan. So that's why I think if I summarize what I just said, first having a very strong systems thinking framework. Secondly, having a plan, a roadmap of where we are, business as usual. What are the stretch targets and what does pioneering look like? Thirdly, really having a vision and understanding what does this actually mean for us in terms of return of investment. The business case analysis is very important. And fourthly, we really need to bring technologies, entrepreneurs, and communities together because there's so much technology moving so fast that there's so many availability of possibilities we need to bring in into our system.
Uh, Very interesting view on holistic development, where every stakeholder has sort of an incentive to work towards, shared values and working towards climate mitigation. My final question is, what is the role of we have touched upon this, like what is the role in decarbonization of cities and communities? I would like to speak about the opportunities we have already spoke about. I would like to speak about the challenges now, because typically when you talk to an investor or a developer, they want to be incentivized. They want, what is the return in 5 years, what is the return in 10 years if I invest this much? So how does one go about this conversation?
So there's two ways of looking at it. From a renewable perspective, the return of investment, it's a very easy conversation because the renewable technology has moved so fast. And right now, a PV panel costs much less than 10 years ago. So the renewable conversation is quite easy. I think the hardest conversation is the embodied carbon, the carbon calculation, because many of the carbon calculation that's required to really create a sustainable building is not often part of a regulatory submission or part of SDAMA or LEED submission. Yes, they do require us to look at carbon by life cycle assessment, but what we are asking, and globally the conversation is to do a whole life carbon assessment. Let me look at all the embodied carbon of a building, all the embodied carbon of the community, whatever materials is being used. So closing that gap between intention and implementation is the hardest conversation. And many times it's a business case analysis is required. And oftentimes we can look at technologies and advances that has already happened to show put the business case together, but oftentimes the intangible is not captured. So that's why UK opened this group called social values, where they identify intangible assessments and investments of a community that's been built to understand what is the intangible effect or what is the intangible benefit or investments. So oftentimes there are some tangible return of investment calculations that could be done, which is energy, water, and food production. But the intangibles needs to be taken account as well as intangible. Like for example, if you create a community and have blue and green infrastructure, what is the benefit of that? Yes, the investor then has to spend on landscaping, but then when we have a storm event, which we had few weeks ago, then the water will be absorbed, the play areas will turn into nice pools, and the buildings will not be flooded. There is work that we do as AECOM and climate resiliency with City of Miami and other cities which are all next to the water and has a huge economy based on tourism. And what we have found is, especially from Hurricane Sandy's work, is that if a $1 is invested, you get $8 back of climate resiliency plan. So that's how the return of investment of climate resiliency is actually working globally. The reason I'm bringing this conversation is, as I said, when we look at near zero buildings, we need to look at near zero buildings with climate resilient buildings. And there is a case globally exists because globally there are cities that has faced a lot of climate resiliency. They have done business cases where we have been part of, and we have those data to show that every $1 invested in climate resiliency plan, you get $8 back. So open call for all the investors and people who does business case modeling is to have more conversations with climate resilience informed urban planners and architects, because there is a business case that could be put forward which does not look like an as usual business as usual business case. It's a little bit different to put these ideas forward, because right now the challenge is not what we are facing now. The challenge is a future climate scenario. If we have another storm, which is every 100-year storm, and if our road infrastructure is does built for 50 years storm, how do we look at the damage that has been done, and how do we prepare our buildings and our infrastructure in a way that it stands the test of time?
I also want to touch upon one point, that is, every climate risk mitigation strategy does not have to be expensive. Like for example, in South India, we had the tsunami 10 years back, and some of the coastal communities realized that areas which had mangrove forests. Oh, is Farah gone? Okay, I will just continue. I,
Yeah.
I
In a
started.
moment, something happened.
I thought.
Blessings of technology.
Yes. So every climate risk or climate mitigation strategy does not have to be expensive, which is something that most people think that, oh, if I have to invest
Yeah.
in climate, it's going to cost me more. So one example is when the tsunami hit, there were communities in the coastal region which were untouched. They were not at all affected because they had pockets of mangrove trees that were growing along their coastline. So mangrove is literally zero investment, but it
Yeah.
will protect you from a greater, climate episode. So, in your experience, what are some of these strategies that you would have seen? You gave the example of Miami. Do you have, from your knowledge, anything else to add?
So, mostly it has to do with blue and green infrastructure. That's the very, very key, because then you create these pockets of green spaces which are used as play areas or green spaces for the community. But when a storm event happens, those green spaces becomes pockets that holds the water, allows the water to seep through. Um, the concept is called sponge cities. It's called something else in other parts of the world. China has done it. There's a lot of these kind of concept we see in Singapore and other coastal areas and the region in US as well. So one of the key aspects when we're looking at decarbonization in our communities is to look at climate resiliency design, and one of them is to look at the blue and green infrastructure. That means how can we have areas which are green spaces, which is very positive for our communities, but also becomes a flood resiliency plan just by itself. Secondly, the material choices of our cities is very important. The pavement has to be porous to hold water. The roads and everything that we're using has to hold water. And then thirdly, the water has to go and be collected somewhere. So having an infrastructure underneath the city that holds this water in a tank that could be used later, these kind of layers, city layers, is very important to think of. Many older cities in ancient time used to have these ideas. Even this part of the world, cities had all these drainages and all these architecture that absorbs water, the passive architecture. I think with technology, sometimes we forget the past and we think that it's not technologically advanced, but now these old ideas are more innovative. With the innovation of technology could be used together. And drainage is something recently you might have seen the big announcement of the 30 billion US dollar funding allocated for drainage. Even UAE has allocated 54 billion US dollar funding for renewable technologies. So really understanding how do we use this funding to create a climate resilient city. So for me, the definition of smart city has changed. I now talk about climate resilient cities because we have identified last 10 years with technology we can really make smart cities, and our cities can be smart. But now this, we have to make our cities more climate resilient, to look at the extreme climate event, to look at how if a population grows or the climate changes or something other natural events happen, how do we become resilient, how fast we go back to normality of life.
Thank you, Farah. I think Mohammed will follow up now. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Farah and Natasha. It was quite interesting discussion. So now, before we move forward to our live Q&A segment, we would have the three takeaways for our today's session for the audience. Farah, can you please share these in your own words and add any context and comments as you wish for these?
Thank you so much, Muhammad. So the first, if you don't take anything away from this conversation, just take away these three things. First is to have a plan, a decarbonization plan. It's not very difficult to do it. What it essentially talks about is asking the right questions. So having a decarbonization plan for your city, for your community, for your building is very important. And essentially, it starts with just simply asking the question, what more could be done? What additional things we could think of? And if we don't do it today, what would that roadmap look like in 5 or 10 years' time? Simply even having that and having having those conversations with clients opens a lot of opportunities and conversations. Secondly, factor in energy efficiency and systematic carbon assessments. We, as built environment professionals, are quite good with energy efficiency, even though the cooling pledge was uh, came into during COP28, and the idea is for enable us to choose efficient HVAC system for the cooling of the buildings. So as engineers, we have a responsibility of energy efficiency. We look at energy efficiency from a passive design perspective, from equipment perspective, but what we don't look often is the carbon side. And there's two aspects of carbon side. One is the materials, looking at the carbon of the materials. Other is looking at the carbon of the HVAC system. So I will really urge you to look at CIBC, CIBSC, where they have identified the embodied and operational carbon assessment for HVAC system. It's a really important information. They have guidances. It just helps the MEP engineers to look at carbon assessment of the MEP equipment for the buildings. This is something new for now, but in few years time this is going to become a norm, especially right now regulations are coming in UK and US, where built environment professionals have to look at embodied and operational carbon, and they can't just look at materials, they have to look at the HVAC system as well. And thirdly, I would say the establish a cost model for the portfolio level decarbonization. Essentially, what it means, and this is specifically for investors, for developers, really understand what is the cost of inaction. And if you're creating a development, of course, it's going to be there for next 30 to 50 years. What will this development become? And having a business plan analysis and looking beyond the business as usual, how we used to do business plan analysis 10 years ago is very much different now. And especially these business cases are changing, especially in Europe, UK, and USA, where Asset Owners Alliance and banks are now asking for a climate resiliency plan, risk assessments, in order to invest on assets and in a portfolio level. There's a lot of different tools could be used to do this cost modeling, and there will be links shared in this webinar. You can download a rough understanding. There's a cost model link there, just to understand what are the questions you should be asking. But remember, it always asks with asking the right questions and understanding what the opportunities and challenges are. And maybe this is something might not be implemented right now in your development, in your project, but having those conversation and information is important, because maybe in few years time it will become more tangible to be developed. So these are my three takeaways from today's webinar. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Farah. Now, moving forward, before our live Q&A session begins, I would love to give you the opportunity to learn more about AECOM and monthly LCA. AECOM is the world's trusted infrastructure consulting firm, delivering professional services throughout the project lifecycle, from advisory, planning, design, and engineering to program and construction management. I would also like to let you know that AECOM has chosen OneClick LCA as their preferred sustainability platform as part of its decarbonization efforts. You can learn more about AECOM by scanning this QR code on the screen, or you can visit aecom.com. I would also like to know more about OneClick LCA. OneClick LCA is the global end-to-end sustainability platform for construction projects and products, with the mission to empower the makers of a zero carbon future. OneClick LCA is working to decarbonize construction and manufacturing with its intuitive cloud-based software to conduct LCA and generate EPDs at scale. With OneClick LCA, you can differentiate with a sustainable edge, winning more business, ensure compliance, and reduce cost via automation. To learn more about OneClick LCA, you can scan this QR code, or you can visit us at oneclicklca.com. Before we move forward with our live Q&A, if you have any lead, Mosdam, BREEAM, or IGBC projects that needs a whole building lifecycle assessment, then I would love to give you the opportunity to receive a free custom consultation from OneClick LCA. If one-click LCS sounds like a solution for your needs, our business team of software experts would love to provide you a tailored custom consultation to show you how our software might work in action for you. So if you are live streaming today's event, you will see a poll pop up asking, do you have a LEED, Amsterdam, BREEAM, IGBC project that needs a whole building lifecycle assessment? If you would like to our business team to contact you to schedule a free custom consultation, just click yes on the poll and our business team would reach out to you. So if you are seeing this in the live stream environment, you can click on the poll. And if you are joining from the LinkedIn, you can click on the link which is being shared and you can book a demo through that with us. We have a team of experts with engineering and scientific education with whom you can have intelligent and productive conversations about fulfilling these requirements and making urban environments healthier and more livable now and into the future. So finally, for the moment we all have been waiting for, we now begin our live Q&A session with Farah and Natasha. So for my first question, I would like to ask you both of you is, can you share some of case studies of Indian projects where AECOM's approach significantly improved building energy performance? So Farah, can you answer that, please?
Thank you so much for the question. I look after the Middle East business, so I can say, give an example of the Middle East business. So we are currently working on several projects. I can't name the name, apologies, because I'm under NDA, where we are looking at cost and carbon modeling. And this is why the partnership with One Click LCA is very important. This is going to be our first global partnership with One Click LCA, and it's going to get formally announced in August. But the idea is that as AECOM, we do a lot of cost and carbon modeling. And by cost and carbon modeling, we provide clients the opportunity to select the materials and understand the return of investment, ROI, that question that Natasha had about the choices that they're making and the communities that they're creating. So if you go to AECOM website and if you go under sustainable legacies is our ESG strategy. You will see a lot of project experiences there that talked about how we are achieving this process. Also in AECOM website, and there's a link that's going to be shared, is the Scope X. Scope X is our process to decarbonize our own emissions as a company and also advise on our infrastructure and building level projects. If you go to the Scope X website, you will see a lot of examples there that talks about infrastructure, transport, building level examples. And those two websites, Sustainable Legacies and ScopeX, covers Indian global projects. So I hope that's helpful.
Yep, thank you so much for that. That was really helpful. So for the second question we have is, what are some of the time-tested strategies which have worked in your experience and could be implemented in the region?
So I will respond this in a global way. So first of all, passive design. We quite underestimate the power of passive design, and passive design can actually reduce the carbon emission and energy emission. In our experience, we have seen 10 years ago it was 15 to 20%. Now we see from 35 to 45%. The reason being passive design allows efficient materials to be chosen. Those efficient materials allows the building to be breathable or non-breathable, whatever is required based on the climate, but allows good carbon embodied carbon factors. And secondly, what we do is that we also look at efficient HVAC systems, whether it's breathable facade, whether it's ventilation systems, cooling systems, or natural ventilation. The idea is that passive design really helps to reduce the carbon emission, not just of the building itself from its materials, but also the HVAC systems. So that would, I would say, one of the biggest thing. The second thing I would say is really understanding what is the whole holistic approach in terms of the business case analysis of sustainable projects. Uh, Clients always come up with ideas, and some of these ideas are great, but we as a consultant have a responsibility to challenge those ideas and to provide them better ideas where possible. Sometimes that works, sometimes that doesn't work, but we have to do our homework. We have to understand what a net zero carbon or a net zero energy building looks like in our part of the world, wherever you're sitting and working, and really identify what are the key steps that you can take. Essentially, people always talk about policies. Policies are very important. Incentivization is important, but also we have to do our part of the story. We have to start looking at what are the decisions I am making in my project, what is my responsibility in the interior design project that I'm doing, the architecture project that I'm doing, or asking myself, have I used embodied carbon calculation of all the carpets that I'm choosing for my project? These small steps can really accumulate to help you as an individual to understand what is that you're trying to achieve and what's possible for you
Great.
to
Thank you
achieve.
so much for answering. So for the last question, I would like to ask is, what are the estimated capital expenditures required for building owners to retrofit their existing buildings to meet net zero carbon standards, and how can these investments be financed?
So if you look at Emirates Green Building website, there's a lot of good case studies sits there within the Emirates Green Building website that talks about the capital expenditure of building retrofits. I would also suggest you to look at UK Green Building Council's website, which is the UK version of EGBC. They have really good case studies and examples and forms that you can download. The third thing I would suggest is look at C40 cities. C40 cities have worked globally, and AECOM was their partner to work in globally 100 cities. Look at climate resiliency of cities in terms of buildings, master plans, and cities. So the capital expenditure that you're asking for, it's a bit hard question to answer because I don't know where you're based. So it depends on the building BOQs of where you're based and understanding what's the business case, what is the business as usual, and as you're making each of the sustainable decisions, what is the cost impact of that, and what is the return of investment on that. One thing I would say is that if the right materials are chosen, which has a lower carbon impact, yes, the materials cost a little bit more, like 5 to 10% more. But if that project is going for solar PV or solar thermal or any kind of renewable technology, the return of investment for those is 3 years or less right now. So even if you are choosing a material that's better in carbon but has a bit uh, higher capex, suppose 7%, but if your PV investment is giving you a 10% ROI in 3 years' time, that's where the balancing is. Sometimes we forget to use the balancing sheet across the project. It has to be from passive design to active design to renewables. Sometimes we just look at cost in a very singular way, like what's the cost of this material and why it's causing more. So this is why I say that the business case analysis of resilient buildings, sustainable buildings is very important, because we can't be looking at just a single source of truth. We need to be looking at the multidimensional effect of that cost of that building and how it's impacting the return of investment in a long term, like 5 years, 10 years perspective.
Great. Thank you for answering that. I think it was really insightful. Finally, let's move to our concluding remarks. We are always happy to hear from you. So if you would like to contact us, please visit us as oneclicklca.com. Or if you would like to learn more about our construction and manufacturing LCA software, you can also write to us directly via sales@oneclicklca.com. You're also welcome to follow us on our LinkedIn and YouTube channels, which we have with educational content, videos, and tutorials about making the industry more sustainable. Lastly, I would like to thank our special guest for today's session, Farah, here. Thank you for joining us again here. It was really great to have you here, and I hope everyone found this session really insightful. Thank you so much. That's all for now, and we will see you next time.